Welcome to the municipality of Waverley in Sydney's eastern suburbs, on the lands of the Bidjigal, Birrabirragal and Gadigal people, who traditionally occupied the Sydney coast. And this is our park, Waverley Park. For over thousands of generations, Aboriginal people have lived in this area seeking food, shelter and harvesting timbers in the scrubby woods that once stood on this site. The land was also grazed, farmed and, over time, became the focal point for sporting clubs, recreational seekers and community groups. Today, this stunning park stands 110 metres above sea level and is a landmark that attracts over 500,000 visitors per annum. This park offers over 40 sports and recreational activities. It is a place where you can enjoy the views, connect with family and friends, celebrate, commemorate, or just relax. Now known as the Eastern Suburbs, it is from the presence of rock art and middens that we now know Aboriginal people camped and fished in Bondi, while gathering in neighbouring areas around Rose Bay, Centennial Park, Double Bay and Camp Cove. There is also evidence of walking tracks that ran through the park connecting Flood Street to Old South Head Road, and it is most likely that First Nations people travelled along these tracks and through the park.
On the basis of our knowledge of how First Nations people moved around, they've said to us many times that they always walked along ridge lines. It enabled them to do two things: examine their own land and to find the easiest way across the sites, remembering these sites were very sandy.
Waverley Park once comprised 3 individual land holdings of around 10 acres each, and in 1844 they were consolidated into one property under the ownership of Mr. T.D. Edwards. While most of the land where the oval is today was said to be wet and boggy, it was ideal for growing vegetables, so 9 acres was fenced off to form Flagstaff Farm.
Market gardening at that stage was an essential land use. It was pre-refrigeration. There was no other way of getting fresh vegetables. There were a circle of land areas around the whole of what was becoming a small city. It then became a location because of the water flow and the fact that the soil here was relatively fertile, where it was sandier on either side. So it became a logical location for market gardening.
To my knowledge, the vegetables grown here at Flagstaff Farm were principally cabbages, but the Chinese grew a lot of leaf vegetables, including what we now know as bok choy. They also grew many root vegetables, principally carrots. My knowledge of Chinese gardening is that there were turnips and swedes and parsnips, but they weren't a priority. The local community were very active in supporting the market gardens.
Despite being in private ownership, the public was granted limited access to the land for recreational purposes, allowing the market gardeners, sports enthusiasts and recreational park users to coexist. Unsurprisingly, this sowed the seeds for permanent public recreational space. The first real steps towards the establishment of a recreational ground in Waverley took place when Mayor John McPherson called a special meeting of council December 30th, 1878, to discuss the purchase of the land for public recreational use. Not long after, with support from the community, the Premier of New South Wales, Henry Parkes, purchased the land for £7,500. on behalf of the council, and the area was gazetted as Waverley Park on June 18, 1880. Naturally, this saw the demise of the Chinese gardens, to the mixed feelings of the locals. And almost immediately after the park was gazetted, the Waverley District Cricket Club made representations to council to establish a permanent cricket ground.
Waverley Cricket Club at that time had perhaps better organisation than some of the other sports. It got the nod and the opportunity to do something to this area in Waverley Park that gave us the ground we now have today, because a lot of work was needed on the playing surface, the outfield, building a fence, side screen, scoreboard, all that had to be done. And with the support of Waverley Council, it was. Cricket would have been number one throughout that period and continued to grow through a profile of people like Victor Trumper, who would have played on this ground at the turn of the 20th century, and so on through Bradman and Ward. I mean, it is an extraordinary history.
You know that face? One of the great ones of Australian cricket, Alan Kippax. It's his benefit at Waverley. And see how many of Australia's ex-internationals you can pick out. Among the stars who have come to do him honour, there's Jack Fingleton, with Oldfield crouching like Nemesis behind him. They may be the boys of the old brigade, but they're still smiling.
By 1894, the Oval was said to be first class, and a pavilion was required to accommodate spectators who came to watch the games.
First Waverley Pavilion was a series of tents. Not very long after the end of the new pavilion here, where that tall lamppost is, it was a very simple weatherboard shed. By the end of the Federation period, so just before the First World War, a much more formal and ornate stand was erected where the existing one is now, with a little tower on the top of it and the sort of wedge shape that the classic grandstand has. That one went on till just after the Second World War, when a larger brick one with a big cantilevered roof was built. It survived up till the 1980s, when a scheme for a much more developed grandstand was proposed with community facilities underneath it.
And the pavilions were essentially built for dressing rooms and a social amenity for cricketers and their friends, and spectators to an extent, because in those days they would have paid sixpence to come into the ground.
Today, the Waverley Park Pavilion, also known as the Margaret Whitlam Recreation Centre, is home to the Eastern Suburbs Cricket Club, as well as hosting many other activities, both inside and outside the centre, showcasing how a facility can develop over time to meet the needs of the changing population.
So the activities that are on in the Margaret Whitlam Centre, we have a fair bit going on a daily basis. We've got our Active Seniors program that runs. We do Pilates, Tai Chi, table tennis, as you can see, yoga, strength and flexibility, other external sports. So we've got soccer, indoor soccer, basketball, pickleball, floorball, volleyball, netball, you name a ball, we have it pretty much in the centre. Yeah. Sports that are in the Oval during the winter, we've got our winter clubs, which consist of rugby union, AFL and rugby league. Just over there in the park, we've got our synthetic field, which is predominantly soccer. We also have our Irish Gaelic football and mixed sports from our schools who utilise that field.
Unsurprisingly, as the popularity of the park grew, attracting families with young children, additional facilities and amenities were required. In 1912, the Waverley Empire Celebration Committee provided funding towards the installation of children's swings, and later, in the 1950s, a Cold War-era space rocket was built in the park, which has now been upgraded along with the rest of the playground facilities. But it is still guarded by another of Waverley Park's icons, the water tower. As the colony grew, so did the demand for fresh drinking water, and in the 1870s, it was decided to build a reservoir.
Well, it's an interesting story and quite a complicated one. because the reservoir isn't just a reservoir, but it's a collection of reservoirs. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important, because it tells the story of the evolution of the technologies of the reservoirs and therefore of the development of the whole of the eastern suburbs. We're standing now on reservoir number 1, which was built as part of the Botany Swamp water scheme, which also brought water to the Paddington Reservoir, which is now a park, and also the one in Wallara, and then up here in Waverley. But that was at about the time where Moriarty, the great engineer of the Sydney water system, had started to bring the water from the Upper Nepean system all the way through to the eastern suburbs. So that water came through from the Cordo Avon dams through to Prospect Reservoir on the Upper Canal, and then redistributed down into Potts Hill and places where it was then pumped up into Waverley into these big tanks. And so reservoir number 2 was built in about 1916, and the wedding cake was finished on top in 1917. One of the reasons why wedding cake, as you call it, is so ornate is because infrastructure such as water is so vital to us to live, and so it needs to be celebrated. And the fact that it's got these wonderful pilasters and Corinthian columns and arched windows and blind, it's as important as a bank or a school or some kind of institution, and so it needs to be celebrated. What's more, it's on the top of the hill where everyone can see it, and it's actually at the highest point in the eastern suburbs, which is why it's there, because it can then feed all the other reservoirs in the area. So it's really critical to the story of the economic development of the whole of the eastern suburbs and of the state.
But this park is not just about sport, recreation, or leisure. It is also a place where we can gather to reflect and commemorate those who came before us, those who sacrificed their lives in war, including some of the district's most promising sports stars.
Norman Calloway was one of those prodigies that came from country New South Wales, and he came here and lived locally as a teenager because his father saw that there was some ability, and being stuck in hay wasn't going to give him the opportunity to play. So right on the edge of the war, he got to play for New South Wales as a 19-year-old player, and not only did he make 100, he made 200 in his first game. So all of a sudden a star had been born. Who's this bloke? And of course, as was the case in those days, he enlisted. And he got to 1917 before, unfortunately, a piece of shrapnel felled him, and that was the end of it. So Norman Calloway is the only cricketer who's ever made a double 100 in his only first-class innings and never played again.
His remains, along with 6 other Waverley cricket players, lie buried in cemeteries overseas.
And you'll find that Norman Calloway is remembered, commemorated in this park, in Waverley Park, when you come up here on Anzac Day.
Waverley Park is more than just a park. It is a place where our community comes together to play, to meet, celebrate and contemplate. So as the demand for open green space and recreational activities continues to grow along with our population, we are in danger of running short of functional green spaces for our growing community.
Waverley Park is very important to the community. I think having green space in any area is so imperative.
Waverley has the wonderful advantage of having one big open space for the community.
We are very lucky in Waverley to be on a coastline, which gives us wonderful public accessible assets such as Bondi Beach, Bronte Beach, Tamarama Gully. They're wonderful assets, and the Bondi Beach is a really large expanse, and it's our other nationally listed asset. But it's true that beyond that, we don't have that many public parks, and that's why things like Waverley Park are so intensely used, because there are few other opportunities.
Waverley is starting to rapidly run out of facilities which we would call parks or recreational areas. A number of them aren't protected because they're zoned as things other than recreational areas. Others are starting to decline because of massive use. And the third thing is distance. If you can't get to a park within 10 minutes, it doesn't function as a community park.
So I absolutely think if there was an area that Waverley could increase, the facilities and fields we could offer, I think that would be great, and I think the community would be very happy about that, absolutely.
That should be a priority for all those who are in power, to make sure there is sufficient, proper public space without robbing the public of some public space that's already utilised very efficiently.
So what can you and I do to ensure the community has continued access to open, green space and recreational activities? Let's respect the traditional custodians of the lands we now inhabit and take the time to better understand our heritage. We need to acknowledge the leaders of the past for their foresight and persistent efforts for what we have today. And forward planning is important to ensure resources are set aside for the preservation and improvement of our parks and reserves for future generations. And if the opportunity comes up again, we hope, like back in the 1870s, our community leaders have the will and foresight to secure available open space for recreational and public use to invest in our well-being. In the meantime, we will continue to use the park for exercise and play, to meet and connect with family and friends, to commemorate and celebrate at our park, Waverley Park.